me talk about one of my favorites.
One of my favorites. You took one of mine.
I was shuffling and I didn't even well, it was like the end of the week, but I just looked straight forward.
Good afternoon. I think you experienced the same thing that I did, because I was in a restaurant yesterday evening and little restaurant entered. It was like light coming there, and then I knew that the personality can give form to something really. This personality can easily redefine popular cinema like he did in the 60s.
Unique. The expression mentira comes from.
Thank you. So we don't have that much time, so I don't think we go to these later films. Many of them are truly remarkable, memorable films, Petulia and How I Won the War and so on. But we'll take the time before the Beatles films and try to get how did you become Richard Lester. So my first question is, what was the first film you saw in your life?
Fantasia. I was 7, and I didn't see another film for 10 years. It's not Fantasia's fault. It's just we didn't live near a cinema.
Yeah. Well, you are an American, so can you describe where you lived and what were the circumstances, your parents and so on?
Well, I had parents.
That's something.
And we lived not near a town, and we didn't have a car, and there weren't buses. So it was really until I went to university, it was the first time I started to see films. And then, thank you forever, I saw Buster Keaton, and my life changed. And I think he still remains one of the most the biggest influence on my life and my work. So that happened when I was in my teens. And then I left America and came to Europe and suddenly started to see films. But the problem was I never caught up with what everybody else knew. So I'm not a cineast, I'm not a cinephile. I don't know all the films of John Ford. I know nothing about that. I am the Douanier Rousseau of British film. Remember Rousseau, when he saw one of Cézanne's masterpieces, said, "Oh, that's good. I could finish that."
What incidentally did you study? You said that you had a short time in the university. So.
Yes, I studied clinical psychology, and I have made no use of it from then until now. Although maybe I think I better start soon.
Well, then how did things proceed in England?
Well, I had been involved from the very beginnings of television in CBS in America. And when I came to England, commercial television was about to start. So provided I helped train other directors, or young people who wanted to be directors, I was allowed to stay. And those were the days where there was no tape, there was no take two, there was no tele-recording. it was all just live. And there, if you want to have a very serious way of learning your job, do live television, because when things go wrong, everybody knows. And it took me about nearly 10 years of television to realize that if you go and make film, you have something magical called take two.
What were the things, can you mention something, certain things there with which you were involved in television, so that period, first period?
The first period, in the very first period, I was involved with a live television western, which meant everything going wrong, with horses falling down, musical instruments exploding, because of the change in temperature from inside sets to outside sets, because you had to run from one bit to the other. So, fortunately, when I went to England, my first big job was with Peter Sellers and Spike Milligan, and called The Goon Shows. And the great thing about those programs is, if a mistake happened, nobody knew. If we had back projection, it ran backwards. They're goons. So it was an easy way to get to know. And out of that came my first film, which was Peter Sellers, Spike Milligan, and I made a film in a day in a field. On 16mm, called the Running, Jumping and Standing Still film. And we only cut it together. It ran as long as the film that we shot lasted. It was 12 or so minutes. And somebody said, we'll take this to an Edinburgh festival. And it went to the festival, and then somebody took it to San Francisco. And in the end, it got an Academy Award nomination. We still only had the one copy, and the entire cost to date to make the film was €80. And because of that, I was an Academy-nominated director on this first bit of film. But fortunately, John Lennon saw it, and because of that, it made my job of, if you like, getting the job of working with them a lot easier.
It's you said in one day you made it.
It was made in a day, yes.
That's incredible. It's an incredible story.
Well, it wasn't a very big field.
Because yeah, sure, but it's well, anyway, it was a film that I remember well, that its reputation came to far away Finland. That we knew about it, we discussed it, and it was totally new view of things. So it's a very good idea, if you're going to make your first film, to make it a film without dialogue, because then it can go quite happily to Finland. Yeah. Nothing personal, of course. Thank you. Well, before going on, so something about Peter Sellers. You worked with young Peter Sellers. Can you tell more about him? What was his way of working? How was he?
Well, in those days he was fat and jolly. Had a wife and 2 children and 2 small dogs, and lived in a simple semi-detached house. And he had not become totally famous, but he was known in television, and he had just made 1 or 2 films with the Bolting brothers. In the course of history, he met some interesting ladies and discovered yogurt, and he became thin and worried and stranger, until in the end he was nearly certifiable, but he was still funny.
It didn't. There was no possibility of you working with him, that you didn't just want to. It was changing too fast.
I worked with him for 3 years. We often talked about projects. It never worked. We never got together again. No. But I'm still very grateful for the time that I had with the Goons, and especially with Spike Milligan, who is, I have a penchant for surrealism, and Milligan was a specialist, and fortunately John Lennon had a great sense of it, which I hope becomes apparent in what we tried to do with Hard Day's Night, to take the strict fictionalized documentary and say to the audience at a certain point, hold on a minute, it's not quite what it looks like. There may be that ability of the surreal to look round the side, because the Beatles had that ability to be that way to themselves. They had the ability to always, even in the heights of their ascension to world fame, they were looking at each other and saying, is this what we should be doing? And that's where I hoped that element of the surreal will help and simplify what we did.
What was the situation when you started preparing Hard Day's Night? At what stage was the Beatles' fame then? It was
when we started work, they were very popular in England. Before we started shooting, they went to America and did the Ed Sullivan Show, and they were then popular in the world. So between the time that we were writing the screenplay and the time that we started shooting was the tipping point of where madness really took over. But the easiest way to describe the construction of the script was I met them after they had just returned from a tour of Sweden. And I said to John, did you like Stockholm? And he said, well, it was a car and a room and a room and a car and a cheese sandwich. And I said, that in essence became the first half of Hard Day's Night. And it was breaking out of that to play in a field, which was the way that we constructed the film.
So it seems that from the very first beginning, John Lennon was the one with whom you had most complicity, that you were going.
It's difficult. I think John had an immense personality, and he was the one that punctured the bubbles of pomposity which all of us filmmakers have in spades. So he was the one that was always checking what was going on. They all had that in them, but I think that John's personality in that respect, in the cynical world, John was the king.
Well, how did you? Because the films are famous and loved because of the group picture and how lively and how kind of understanding is how you see the mechanics of the group. How did you approach that? How did you find the characteristics, find the visual equivalence for these guys?
Well, I think the first thing we did is we constructed a script which had its highs and its lows and its speeds and its slowing down, and stuck very firmly to that. Put the music in where we thought it would be helpful for the rhythm of the whole piece. Stuck to the dialogue that was written. There was very, very little improvisation. Maybe in the interviews with the press, the press conferences, but that's about all. But from the visual standpoint, everything was open. I mean, the script read, the boys escape down a fire escape and play in a field. Nothing else. When we got to a field, we just worked it out. I had some practice with fields, as you know. I think what we had to try is to make sure that the elements that were not real, the first one happens in the train when suddenly they are not in the carriage talking to a man from the establishment, but they're outside. That is setting up the next event, which is when they were playing cards and playing music simultaneously as a means of making a song work. And then the next one, I suspect, was John Lennon going down the plug hole in the bath. So they were little bits of lardons which were put into the meat. Sorry, the meat all the way through. I mean, if you ask how it's technically done, I think the simple English expression is 3 words, which is kick, bollock, and scramble. That wherever we were, suddenly out of the ground would pop up 2,000 screaming children who had nothing to do with us and chased us. And the police who had given us permission to shoot in a particular place would suddenly rip that up and say, no, you're causing terrible disturbance, go. So to do take 2, we would have to go 4 blocks in another direction, set the camera up and try to do it there. So that was not easy. And the fact, I think as you probably know, that the idea for the film came from the music department of United Artists, the film company. And they said, if we make a low-budget, black and white film and start shooting in March, we can have it in the cinemas in July. And that's fine, because if we, by the end of the summer, as we think, the Beatles will be a spent force, and then we will at least have had a good release. What that meant is that we had only 6.5 weeks to shoot in March, and 3.5 weeks to cut the film, to cut the negative, to do a final dub, and to get a release print. And that is not easy. I think my one great memory of it is the trying to, and I think those of you who are technically minded, one forgets that in those days you'd go for a take of 10 minutes of optical film, which meant that all your reels, there was a picture reel, there were 3 music sound reels, there were the dialogue reels, there were the sound effects reels. They were all up on projectors, and if the mixer got a bit wrong, you had to stop everything, go back, rewind. Everything comes off the projectors, they're put on benches and rewound, and it takes a half an hour to get everything back to go for take 2. And I had a wonderful editor, no longer with us, I'm afraid, called Johnny Jimson. And he was getting so angry at our rather middle-aged sound mixture that the studio had, that at one point he went crazy and he picked up the first thing he had to throw it at this sound mixer as hard as he could. And fortunately for the film and for everyone else, the only thing to hand was a cashmere sweater, which gradually floated down onto the desk, and we then carried on.
How was the script developed? How did you get that? Because if it was followed, so
well, we went. The writer and I went to Paris when they were playing the Olympia with I think they were the number 2 act, I think, Françoise Hardy, and we stayed in the George Cinq when they played the Olympia, went before it, going there in cars, doing the show, coming back to the hotel, big blondes, small blondes, medium-sized brunettes, cheese sandwiches, and a lot of something which was whiskey and Coke, which is a disgusting drink which they all drank, because nobody could tell that there was mostly whiskey. And in essence, the film wrote itself before our eyes. We just took notes.
So plenty of the things were picked from the things you overheard. And
absolutely.
Following, yeah.
Yes.
who of these, who were the most inventive guys here in this respect? Are they equal or?
They were all equal. You have to remember, they were four very equal people, very much closer than we tried to separate them a little bit. We gave them false idiosyncrasies. George was mean, Paul was cute, John was cynical, Ringo was picked on by the others. And it just helped, it was something to hang their personalities on. But in essence, they were very alike, and they were very, very supportive of each other. If one of them had too much to drink or had a problem at home, the others would protect them and take over, and they would be the ones that would be doing the jokes and being aggressive and outlandish, and the other one can recover, and then they would switch around. It was really a very interesting thing to watch, and I was privileged to be part of it over a period of 3 or 4 years.
That's fascinating, because it's exactly these things that separate this film from a documentary. Because if it would have been a documentary, it wouldn't have outlived all this time. It wouldn't have become a definition of them like it did.
Well, I think that's not for me to say. I mean, I'm astonished that we're here. I'm very astonished that we're here. And that you're kind enough to come in on a beautiful day and watch a film that's 50 years old.
Yeah. Well, can you talk about this for individuals one by one? Then what you remember best of them, about what attracted in this and that personality? So.
Well, I'm not sure I'd like to do that, because it gets back to them at all. I will answer what most people say, which is who was the best actor. That's almost impossible, but I think by and large, the person that was in the middle was George Harrison, and he tried less than some of the others, but everything he tried, he just about hit in the center. You knew that you would get George, and George would come up with it. Sometimes John probably had the ability. I made a film afterwards called How I Won the War with John, who was playing a straight acting part, and I said to him halfway through, when we just finished a scene, I said, you know, John, if you really wanted to do this, you could become quite a considerable actor. And his answer was, yes, but it's bloody silly, isn't it? And there isn't really an answer to that. And Paul, I think, was so enamored of the whole idea of film and their place in show business and art and serious art and involvement with the modern art galleries and the theater and all that, that in a way he was never devoted, I suspect, to the technique of acting. And Ringo was just a natural, you know. It's poor old Ringo was picked on. I mean, the most famous remark, I think, it was somebody came to John and said, do you think Ringo is the best rock drummer in the world? He said he's not even the best drummer in the Beatles. So you see, poor old Ringo was up the back, and he was picked on.
How were the songs of this specific film chosen? Was the record company who more or less kind of had the idea of?
No, the Beatles and George Martin produced 10 songs, and I discarded 2, and I can't even remember the ones that I discarded or why. They just, on a first listening, I thought they wouldn't fit into the rhythm of the film as well as the others. And nobody questioned that. They just said, well, he's the director, okay. So if there are 2 songs on that album that I should have had in the film. I apologize, but it just seemed right at the time.
How many cameras did you shoot for the concert scenes?
6.
6.
And what was interesting, we had our own 3 cameras, and we brought in 3 extras, and one of which is a person that I'd never met. And at the end of the first day's shooting, and there was a hell of a lot of footage going through the cameras, and putting it together, not one frame of this person that I didn't know was ever put into the finished film. There are some operators who've left to their own devices, as they have to be. They were stuck in the middle of these screaming children, that had the instinctive ability to pan away from something that was just becoming interesting. We just never used it. One of the other operators, who was right in the middle of the crowd, and I think, looking at you all, you were rather too young to have heard that noise in the cinema at the time. Was so disturbed by it that he lost 4 of his teeth. The sonic boom of shooting a whole day with these screaming children meant that he had to go to the dentist, have the next day off, and have the teeth removed. That's got you quiet. Anybody that decides you don't want to see the film because of it, it isn't as loud as that.
Can you describe the kind of the audience of that time? We have all seen it on film, but really that how, because it was exactly the moment that they were becoming enormous phenomenon. So can you
let's put it this way. We shot in a theatre called the La Scala Theatre, which was where that whole last concert happened. And by 10 o'clock on the first day, children had found hacksaws and cut through the bars, you know, the doors to escape doors were being sawn in half. And they just poured in, and you're supposed to, by law, have professional children that all had signed release forms, and that they were part of the union and all this. Well, 2,000 or 3,000 other children came in amongst them, and it was just bedlam, and it stayed that way for the rest of the week.
How did this influence the group itself? They were in front of your eyes. They were becoming so famous.
Well, I think it was from that time on. They knew that in most places where they would be playing, they couldn't hear themselves play. I mean, they did everything that they could, but it was getting to the point. And by the concert in San Francisco, which was only about a year or so after it, they said, we're never going to tour anymore because we can't hear ourselves and nobody seems to be paying any attention. It's just this wall of shouting and screaming and singing along. And so they stopped and became a recording band. So it didn't take long.
Then can you tell something about your chief cameraman?
For A Hard Day's Night?
Yeah.
Well, he and I had made a film together about 3 years before, which was a pop musical. And I had only 2.5 weeks to shoot that one. So I used my television technique, which is working with multiple cameras. And in fact, from the time of that, which was my first feature film, the only way I could get 90 minutes of a musical film in 2.5 weeks was by having multiple cameras. So I used 3 cameras then, and by and large, for the rest of my career, I only used multiple cameras. I normally operated one of them myself. And it meant that I could work quickly and also not worry about continuity. And I always wondered, and I still do, as to why so few directors use the technique, because to try to shoot a musical film with one camera would take 20, 30 weeks. Or, for example, I made a film with George C. Scott and Julie Christie, and at one point George C. Scott throws a bag of biscuits at his ex-wife, and we never rehearsed it. And when George Scott threw it, he threw it as he meant it, and it hit the actress full in the face, and she then had to carry on responding to this sudden outburst and all the emotions of the ex-wife and what she was after. And if I'd had only one camera and then went and said to the actress, now we're going to do your close-up, she would have known absolutely what it felt like. She would have been ready for it. And even if she were the greatest actress in the world, it wouldn't have been the same. But by having a camera on her, a camera on George, and a camera on the scene, it all matched perfectly. And that first moment of shock and bits of biscuits in her hair and starting to cry was magical. It was absolutely wonderful. And I think to myself over and over again, why doesn't everybody do this? Answers on a postcard, please.
So with well, we can see that you with these multiple camera techniques, you got beautifully sketched individual portraits at the same time as the whole scene. That was one of the results. The one camera would never have done that.
Exactly.
Yeah. And there was a great scene to be filmed, because if you think historically, so there was no such film as a rock and roll film by then. I mean that it meant, at that stage, it meant the idiotical beach musicals of Elvis Presley. So there was nothing, no film form to correspond to what was really happening. So that was kind of born with this film, more or less.
And the difficulty with trying to respond to that is that once I knew that I was going to make the first film, which was in 1961, I deliberately didn't watch any musical films at all, and still haven't to this day. So, I mean, I am, as I said, the douanier Russo. I never watched films like John Borman's film Catch Us If You Can, the Frank Rodham films. I don't know what they looked like or anything about them. I thought it's best that I just keep plunging away like an idiot down a narrow field. So the last musical film I think I saw was Jazz on a Summer's Day, and that was what, the 50s?
59 probably. And it's one of the few films that kind of tries to find form to how to present jazz. It's also an original film. As to the editing, can you tell about that? How much did you participate in the process?
I think, to be honest, the most pleasure in being a film director is the editing process for me. Pre-production is fine because everything is ahead of you and it looks good. Shooting is agony because you are wasting money all the time. You know, no matter what you do or what you think you're doing, you are burning money. And you know, if you have any sense of social responsibility, you hang your head in shame by the end of the film. And I tried desperately not to overspend and not to waste time. But some things happen. It's you know, it's not in your hands. You have drivers who can't find the right actor to bring to the set, and so you lose half a day's work, and it drives you nuts. Once that's over, and you get into the editing process, it's the great opportunity. It's your take two. It's how you can repair all the things you get wrong. because I'm not a perfectionist in any possible way, and I would not be the one to do. I remember going in the studio where I used to work to watch a film being made by Warren Beatty, and the scene they were shooting was Diane Keaton was typing on a typewriter. It was a film called Reds, and she had to type something, pick the sheet up to about there, look at it, was dissatisfied with it, threw it up, scrunched it up and threw it in a waste paper basket. And when I walked in, they were shooting 92 of the takes to get, and I thought, she's not saying anything, and she's just scrunching up a piece of paper and throwing it in a bin. 92 takes. I didn't realize that there was a sort of relationship between Mr. Beatty and Miss Keaton at the time, but so I didn't stay very long. But so that's not me. I'd try to say, well, there's a bit of this that works. I'll find a way in the editing. I'll try to do something to make it work. And by and large, if you have multiple camera things, you can get from one to another. You can move things around, but you try to keep it as fresh as possible. George Scott, who we were talking about, it was to me the finest actor that I've ever had the privilege of working with. And his instincts on the beginning, I mean, when reading the script, doing the first rehearsal, were perfect. I mean, beyond your wildest dreams of what you hoped the part would be. But he had a very low threshold of interest. And if we went beyond the third or fourth take, George would go into the corner and start doing imaginary golf swings. And I know I would get probably one more good take out of him because he had lost it. And so we ended up shooting his rehearsals. We never told him we did. We just had a nod and a wink, and the cameras turned over. And sometimes he was scratching his head and doing it, but he was just perfect. But that allowed him to remain fresh, and that's something that I've tried to do in all the work that I've done.
So we got into Petulia after all. It was a very fine film. So did any of the Beatles have, when you saw that enormous amount of material, did they have moments when they were kind of stagnated or so, as lively as in the film?
Well, they didn't have time to stagnate.
Yeah. How long did the editing take?
3.5 weeks.
Only?
Until to get into the cinema, to actually have the print delivered to the London Pavilion.
That's again unbelievable.
It is. It was frightening. It was very frightening.
Yeah. Well, then
sweaters were thrown.
Well, still about editing, it's obvious at the stage where you, in a way, you worked with your surrealist undercurrent very much, because it comes from there. It can't be in the shooting or so, but it's a very, very strange tension in the film. So
well, it seemed the right way to make that film, and it seemed the right film to make at that time. And basically, all we were trying to do is to take what we felt about 4 extraordinary people and show it to an audience and say, you know, you'll like these people. They're fun to be with.
And they are unity, and as you said, they were unity in real life in a very, very strong sense. So you didn't have to build that; it was there.
Yes, what's interesting is that I signed a poster and saw what the film was called in Italy, And in essence, it's the sort of musketeers again, isn't it? Is it what was it? 1 for 4 or 4 for 1?
Yeah.
4 for 4?
So
Yeah.
it's a beautiful connection. Yeah. Of course. Well, how sure you were that it would become a tremendous success?
There wasn't time. I was sure before we started shooting that they were extraordinary, and unless I really made a mess of it, I ought to be able to capture this. And the unique quality happened that because of their exposure on the Ed Sullivan Show, after all the deals had been done and the budget was fixed, is the album of Hard Day's Night, the disc, was owned 100% by United Artists who were financing the film. So before we started shooting, the advance sales on the disc meant that the film was already in profit. So it was going to be difficult to get that wrong.
It occurs that it's evident that it was the best possible time, the ideal time to make the film, because they were still fresh. And if you would have made the film 6 months after, they wouldn't have been the same personalities.
It would have been a different film, and it would have been called Help.
Yeah. Yes, sure. It was called Help, but I mean that it's for this kind of the longevity of this phenomenon. It's beautiful that they were captured in their freshness and innocence in that stage. That the eternal picture of them is this film. It's nothing else.
I'm sure you've heard other directors say it, is that films are really a mirror of their times. Mine, I hope, were those circus mirrors, that they're slightly distorted, because I don't like to see things as they are, but I would love to go around the back and see it from the side. If you are dealing with something that seems interesting at the time, it should work.
And it was obviously in England. It was a time when England became the center point of many kind of modern phenomena.
It was a good cusp, because it was still not that long since the war, and I mean I think it works perfectly if you say the establishment was still there to be shot at. So I fought the war for you was still around everywhere, and those Beatles were the ones to fight that.
Yeah. Yes, it's that's very poignant of that. It is about more time than only just that moment. It's about the whole after-war period. That it's a liberation, one of the liberation movies.
You know, things were going terribly well until Time magazine had a cover saying "Swinging London," and from then on it was downhill quickly.
What other things that were in the air interest you then? What would you remember as your favorite thing?
Well, everything was happening, and it was all they were all intertwined. The fashion was a very big number. It was all ephemera, but it was enthusiastic and optimistic, and that sense, if you really want to do it, all you have to do is to learn 3 chords on a guitar. So it was a good time for that. And it really didn't last much beyond late 66, 67. Then you go to Haight-Ashbury and Vitu there, and Vietnam, and then the May riots in 68. It was a short honeymoon period, but God, it was fun.
What is your present opinion of health? Your memory of health?
Well, to me, it was the only way we could deal with what we had available to us. We didn't just want to make Hard Day's Night in color. We didn't want to do a film about their private lives because it would have been X-rated. We therefore took the decision, rightly or wrongly, that we should find a story that attacked the fore and use the story as a device to try to show them as they were in 1965. This, as you probably know, led John Lennon to say very kindly that we're extras in our own bloody film.
What was the difference between the process of Hard Day's Night and Help? Because Help was much more kind of technically sophisticated and so on and so on.
Do you mean chemically?
Yeah.
It was different.
Yeah. Okay. after this,
it's lovely to have someone from Finland to keep everything calm.
After this public humiliation, I will give you a chance for a couple of questions. We still have some time. I failed. Thank you. Please, is there a microphone?
I have one.
Yeah.
Hi. I always was wondering about the use of the beginning of the film, right when the chord begins. Did you of A Hard Day's Night? Did you feel that you knew that the movie was always going to start with that chord, that song, that very first frame of them running? Was that all planned from the beginning?
I think you speak with some knowledge, but I will tell the audience the story. If you don't, you're very aware. I always felt that when we heard the Hard Day's Night, that we should start the film absolutely from black, and that there would be no titles before, no producers presenting, no United Artists, nothing. I just wanted to start from black. The chord hits, and suddenly they are running towards the camera. And I've managed to succeed, and we had a world premiere, a royal premiere with royalty, and we were all in evening dress in the London Pavilion 50 years ago, tomorrow. The lights went down, but unfortunately the cinema had an organist who was playing a mighty Wurlitzer organ, songs from Beatles hits. And he had a circle of light on him, and he was playing away. And the film, the black happened, the chord happened very quietly, because he hadn't finished his bits of music, and he played on while this chase happened until he finished, and the organ went down, and he was waving as he went. And I was sitting in the audience in tears, and there's nothing you can do about it. That was the way the film, that was the first time it was ever shown to an audience. So, thank you for that question. You don't have an organist in your family, do you?
I have a question. What was your working relationship like with the artist that you so admired, Buster Keaton, and can you talk about your first meeting with him?
Well, I had found out that he was once offered the part of Pseudolus in Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum on the stage, and was either not available or turned it down. So when we went to make the film, it was unnatural for me to try to get him, and he agreed to do it. And we met for the first time in Madrid, which is where we made the film. And I didn't realize at the time that he was already seriously ill. His wife was a nurse, and she had told him that he had asthma, but in fact he had cancer of the throat and was having serious breathing difficulties. So I had hired, I think, the world's greatest mover, and to me one of the greatest film directors of all time. And he could barely run, it meant that I had to hire a stunt double to do Buster Keaton's action while he did the words, and Buster was not great with words. So I really ended up with the worst of it all. But I was so thrilled to have the chance just to sit on the set with him. And we would talk about filmmaking, and he was saying this scene seems to be going all right, but of course you won't know until you show it to an audience. And I said, well, I don't think that's going to work, Buster, because you're here. Zero Estelle lives in New York. Phil Silvers lives in Los Angeles. I'm cutting the film in London. If we wanted to do it again, it would cost a fortune. He said, yes, you see, in my day, all my actors were I paid them by the year. And the only thing it cost was the film stock and the petrol for the lorries. And if a sequence didn't quite work, we would throw the whole sequence out. We'd throw 10, 12 minutes away and go and start it again. And if they didn't like it the second time, they'd show it to an audience. It didn't get the right laugh, throw it out and start again. And the experiences of the way he worked and the way we worked. But he still remains to me one of the men who had the ability to place a camera in a way that the space around him was funny, and you just knew that if you moved that camera 2 feet further forward or 2 feet further back, it would cease to be as funny as he made it. He was impeccable, and a great skill mechanically, because all those gags that he developed and worked out, he knew how to do them mechanically. He was a great genius.
You had said that you didn't watch any musicals before you filmed A Hard Day's Night, which is fascinating. There's sort of an argument among us film scholars that there's sort of a thread from the innovative editing of the French New Wave to A Hard Day's Night, that in a way, and there was just a piece published in an American online magazine, Salon, by their film critic talking about Breathless by Jean-Luc Godard and A Hard Day's Night, and just talking about the impact of the film, but also the way it kind of popularized French New Wave innovations, jump cutting, and so on. So when you were talking about the scene where suddenly the Beatles are outside the train car and singing, and all the discontinuities there. So I'm just wondering, did the French New Wave have any role as you were preparing to make the film, where you were probably watching their films?
Yes,
because everyone was watching their films.
And I was an enthusiast, and I liked Truffaut's films. I liked the early Godard, definitely, and Alain Resnais. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. There is a line there. It's not a line that one takes knowingly. And any more than I was deliberately trying to do anything that was Keatonesque. But it's part of, it becomes part of your DNA. It's why I was trying so hard not to get involved in other people's musical work. But I just enjoyed the Nouvelle Mode very much. If we had longer, I would tell you a long, funny story about that. But,
Oh, do. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Right. My second film was with Margaret Rutherford, and it was called Mouse on the Moon. A film where in order to make it, we had to use the leftover film sets from Cornell Wilde. Yes. There's someone old enough to snigger. So it was one of those things where we didn't have a lot of freedom and we didn't have a lot of money, but it was a sort of Ruritania film. And it starred Margaret Rutherford. And now before you make a film, all the director and the main actors all have to have a physical examination to have an insurance policy that they are fit and able to do the 7 weeks filming. And she went to have her medical, and it was a young doctor, and he was taking her blood pressure. And he said to make conversation, and what are you doing, Miss Rutherford, at the time? And she said, well, I'm playing in Agatha Christie in the theatre in Drury Lane, and I'm making this film at Pinewood Studios. He said, but you're 70-something, whatever it is, years old. That's much too much work for you. She said, are you telling me that I can't do it? The blood pressure is going up. And he failed her. He said, this woman has high blood pressure, she's not employable, she's not insurable. This was 4 days before we started shooting. Well, to try to speed it up a bit, we found out how much my salary and the producer's salary were, and we worked out that we would be able to have 2 days shooting for what that was. We put our salary up, and I said, if I can shoot all her lines of dialogue in close-up, I can then have that ready. If she dies after 2 days, we can use a body double. And the body double can do long shots, but I'll have all her dialogue in close-up. So the first day shooting, she comes in, we have a blank screen and some blue sky and a stool. And I said, well, Miss Rutherford, what I'd like to first is if you could sit on the stool and look left. And could you do all the dialogue of scenes 42, 57, and 63, looking left, which she did. And then, now, could you do it again, looking right? And then that was taken, and bits of a wall came behind her. I said, now, scene's 84, and you're on a horse. Anyway, this happened and at the end of the first day, her husband came to pick her up. And as she was leaving and she was going out the door, she said, well, if this is the Nouvelle Vague, I want no part of it.
Okay, our time is up. Thank you for the